Hey everyone, welcome to the video series from the tax subject in the CPA program. In this video series we're going to be going through some example multiple choice questions which you can download from our website. Now we're going to be not only just giving you the questions, but in this video series we're going to go through each question and showing you the approach, the thought process, how you use the notes and other resources we provide to actually get the question right. So for the first question, we've got, which of the following statements is correct? A, decisions of the AAT are binding on the federal court. B, the federal parliament cannot enact legislation that contradicts case law developed by the courts. C, the courts may use records of parliamentary debate to assist in the interpretation of legislation. Or D, a decision of the federal court is final on income tax issues. So if you're not sure how to approach these questions, so the first recommendation would be to watch our core content video on module 1, which will explain the fundamentals for you. Okay, so go ahead and watch that if you have time. If you don't have time, I'll just show you how the best way to approach this. What I've got here is my tax notes A, and I'm going to go through to chapter 1, right? So the first thing is decisions of the AAT are binding on the federal court. So we know that's not the case because the AAT it holds disputes and it's binding on those parties in that particular dispute. But if any of those parties wants to question that, they can then take it to the next level of court. So they can take it to federal court all the way up to the High Court of Australia. These courts are not bound by any binding of the AAT. Okay, so it's not A. And then B, the federal parliament cannot enact legislation that contradicts case law developed by the courts. Now, this is also wrong for a few different reasons. So firstly, there is a separation of powers, right? So legislature, judiciary, executive, which we know. And we know that the courts applies the law to individual cases, right? There's no overlap between them. So parliament makes the laws, executive enforces it, judiciary interprets it, but in no way does the parliament tell the court to enforce it a particular way, and the courts don't tell the parliament to pass legislation a certain way. So there's no correlation between them, and that's why we have a transparent and fair system. So the other reason why this is incorrect is because of this statement or doctrine of precedent, where courts are bound by the ratio of courts higher in the court hierarchy, but even then its statements are persuasive rather than binding. So in no cases it's binding within the court system, it's just persuasive. So it's a good precedent that courts tend to draw to but don't have to draw to. So B is also definitely incorrect. And the next one is C, is the court may use records of parliamentary debate to assist in the interpretation of legislation. So if you're not sure that this is the right answer, we can just also use the approach of deduction and figure out which ones are the wrong answers. So if D is wrong, then the answer is C, and if C is wrong, then the answer is D. But I know that the answer is C because I know this is correct. The courts may use records of parliamentary debate to assist in the interpretation of legislation. That is correct. There is a particular section within the Acts, section 15AB, which allow the courts to pull records like that, including debates within Parliament. But that's okay if you didn't know that. We're going to use the process of deduction to eliminate D to figure out C. Or, if you're still not convinced, eliminate D to prove it's C. But either way, we'll find out in a second. So D, a decision of the federal court is final on income tax issues. So, well, first of all we have to do is look at the ordering of the federal court system, right? So if the federal court system, they may have a court case which they're ruling on. Now, if they rule on this, is at the end of the... If one of the parties doesn't agree with it and they want to take it further, is at the end of it? Well, the answer is clearly no, because there's two whole levels higher than that. There's the full federal court of federal court, and then there's the High Court of Australia. And both of these can overwrite the judgment in any lower court. So D is clearly incorrect. So C is clearly the correct answer via deduction, but also via logic. All right, so let's move on to question B. So which of the following professionals would not be considered a tax practitioner and therefore would not need to register with the Tpb? Again, this one's fairly straightforward. All we have to do is pull up our notes and go to the section on Tpb in terms of which types of tax practitioner it covers. Fairly straightforward. It's tax agents, BAS agents, and tax advisors. So it's going to be tax agent, BAS agent, tax financial advisor. So clearly the answer to this one is going to be D. right? Pretty straightforward, easy to do. All right, so let's move on to the third one. So which one of these statements is not correct in respect to a professional accountant? A, must not allow bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override professional judgment. B, must maintain confidentiality or information required as a result of professional and business relationships. C, must maintain professional knowledge and skill at a level required to ensure a client or employee receives competent services. Or D, a public practice, or D, must comply with the relevant laws and regulations and avoid any action that discredits the profession. So the approach to this would be to bring up our notes and go to the section where we start talking about the ethics and the requirements of a professional accountant. So we need to go to the section on APS. And I know this because we went through this in our core content video for Module 1. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's going to make this a whole lot easier. So, where did we get that from? Here we go here, integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behaviour. So we just need to find out which one of these doesn't fit into this. So, alright, so the first one is integrity, right? Must not allow bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence to override professional judgment. Okay, so this one is bias, conflict of interest, or undue. So this one would be objectivity, right? So this is B, objectivity. And then B over here, must maintain confidentiality of information as required as a result of professional and business relationships under all circumstances. This is correct. Confidentiality is correct, but this bit is incorrect because as accountants, and you'll probably learn this just by getting the question wrong initially, is accountants don't have to maintain confidentiality under all circumstances. Number one, if it's required by law to disclose that information, then you must do it. That's one example, but there's a couple of other examples, like it's required by the court of law and so forth. So yes, confidentiality is on our criteria list over here, confidentiality at number D, but it's not at all circumstances. It's only in situations where it's not legally required to disclose that information. And then let's just go through the other ones just in case, just to tick it off. So C is must maintain professional knowledge and skill required to ensure a client receives competent services. So that's going to be professional competence to due care. And then D is must comply with relevant laws and regulations and avoid any action that discredits the profession. And then that one would be professional behavior. So pretty straightforward. The answer is B. Alright, next question. So which one of the following is not a business activity statement service under the Tax Agent Service Act 2009, Commonwealth TASA? A, representing their client in dealings with the Commissioner of Taxation arising out of a luxury car tax issue. B, advice regarding the application of the goods and services tax. C, registering a client for pay-as-you-go services. Or D, preparing a bank reconciliation so that the BAS can be prepared. Alright, so for this question, how I would approach this is I would bring up the section in relation to the Tax Practitioner Board. So you can see the three key areas, which we already know, so tax agent, BAS agents, and tax financial advisor over here. So what we know is, let's just do a quick recap. If the provider of tax agent is providing a fee for reward for either tax agent services, BAS agent services, or tax financial advice services, which in short is basically lodging tax returns, lodging BASs or any of these, or providing tax financial advice, they need to be registered. So to answer this question, we just need to know which one of these does not fit into that category. So A, representing their client in dealings with the Commissioner of Taxation arising out of a luxury car tax issue. So that would be a tax advice, so that one would be correct. They need to be a registered tax agent for that. B is advice regarding the application of goods and services tax, so that would be advice. So that would be correct as well. C is registering a client for pay-as-you-go services, so you need to be a tax agent to do that. That's part of your BAS lodgement services, is registering a PAYG, including the withholding of PAYG down here. So this includes the preparation, lodgement, signing up and registration, etc. And then the final one is D, preparing a bank rec so that the BAS can be prepared. So it doesn't actually say who's preparing the BAS. All we know is that they're preparing a bank reconciliation, which anyone can do. You just need to give that to a BAS agent and then they can lodge it. But it doesn't say that they're actually lodging it themselves. So the answer to this one would be D, because anyone can do a bank rec, even if it's going to be used for a BAS, as long as you're not lodging the BAS yourself. So D is the correct answer for this question here. Okay, so next question is, which of the following describes the overarching principle for accountants in APS 1110, Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants? Okay, so for this one, how I'd approach this is I'd bring up our notes and go to the section on APS, Code of Ethics. So clearly there's 5 fundamental principles, right, which we talked about through integrity, objectivity, professional competence, confidentiality, professional behavior, and so forth. So all of these, provided they're in here, are correct in some sense, but the question is specifically asking what's the overarching principle, right? So we did actually cover that in our core content video for this, and the overarching principle right here, it says, is to act in the public interest. So clearly the answer is B. So the others are also correct, but the most correct answer is B. Alright, so let's move on to the next question. So which of the following statements regarding ethical behavior is correct? So A, conflicts of interest do not need to be declared if the tax practitioner is aware of the conflict. Complying with all legislation will ensure that tax professionals have not breached their ethical obligations or moral convictions. Where professional standards conflict with taxation law, a ruling should be sought from the TPB to determine the appropriate course of action. When there is no clear resolution to an ethical conflict, tax professionals should refuse to remain involved with the matter that is creating the conflict. Alright, let's go through these one by one. So it's not really something that we can refer to specifically in the notes, because it's more of a overarching issue which you understand by watching our video on the topic. So we're just going to have to use logic for this particular question. So let's go one by one. So conflicts of interest do not need to be declared if the tax practitioner is aware of the conflict. So, I mean, that's not necessarily correct, because conflicts of interest do need to be declared. It's not just being aware of the conflict and not disclosing it. You need to disclose those conflicts of interest as well. Remember, we can use the ethical dilemma checklist as a framework for this particular question, because ultimately what we need to do is gather, assess, decide if it's legal, identify any affected parties, consider courses of action, if necessary, seek professional legal advice, refuse to be associated with the conflict, right? So we know that A is incorrect. B is complying with all legislation will ensure that tax professionals have not breached their ethical obligations or moral convictions. So we know that legality and ethical issues are different categories, right? Sometimes both can be satisfied. Sometimes something can be ethical but illegal. Sometimes something can be legal but unethical. So it's not necessarily a clear-cut thing. And we can derive that from the tax evasion versus tax avoidance versus tax fraud as a great example, because, for example, tax avoidance is technically legal but it's morally unethical. This one's illegal and unethical, whereas this one is legal and ethical. So B is clearly correct because of the concept that ethics and legality are two different, completely mutually exclusive categories. So C is where professional standards conflict with taxation laws, a ruling should be sought from the TPB to determine the appropriate course of action. So let's refer back to our flowchart. So where professional standards conflict with taxation law, a ruling should be sought from the TPB to determine the appropriate course of action. So let's go through here. When do we need to reach out for the TPB? Well, probably not at all. I mean, the fact that you're gonna have professional standards conflicting with taxation law all the time, you don't necessarily need a ruling. So a ruling is for high-level applications of interpretation of specific acts. It's not there for general advice on conflicts of ethics and law. You might want to speak to a lawyer for that, you might want to speak to a colleague for that, but you probably don't want to go to something as sophisticated as the tax board. So C would also be incorrect. So logically D is the correct answer, but we also just want to go through this and make sure D is actually correct, because if we go through a process and A, B, C, and D are all incorrect in your initial attempt, you've probably missed something. So we just don't want to assume automatically that D is the correct answer, because D could also be incorrect because we've missed something in part A or something. So let's just confirm this. So where there is no clear resolution to an ethical conflict, tax professionals should refuse to remain involved with the matter that is creating the conflict. Okay, so this one is correct because we know from our flowchart that the last step on this, where if there's no clear resolution, right, so they've gone through all the steps, they've considered all the possible courses of action, and if there's no clear resolution, then you need to refuse to be associated with the conflict. So clearly D is correct. Okay, so let's now move on to the next question. So James is a registered tax agent. His wife Lee is CEO of a car shop. James is approached by CPP, a rival manufacturer, and is asked to provide tax agent services, including tax planning work. Which of the following elements of the Tpb Code of Professional Conduct is most relevant to consider before accepting CPP as a client? Alright, so A is an agent must ensure that a tax agent service is provided competently. B, an agent must comply with taxation laws in the conduct of the personal affairs. C, an agent must not knowingly obstruct the proper administration of the taxation laws. Or D, an agent must have in place adequate arrangements for the management of conflicts of interest. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pull up the Tpb Code of Ethics, which was at the beginning. Okay, cool. So here, Tpb covers 3 types. Here are the 5 categories of 14 fundamentals. So honesty, integrity, independence, confidentiality, competence, and other responsibilities. And on top of that, there must be a process in place to identify threats to compliance, evaluate significance of the threats, and apply safeguards to eliminate threats. So if we go back through here and we just compare some of these, so A is most relevant to consider before accepting CPB as a client. So the crux of this question is that there is potentially a conflict of interest. So James is approached by a rival manufacturer, right? So his wife has a car shop, right? And he's also approached by a rival competitor of his wife's car shop. So there's a conflict of interest that he could use the information that is being received by this competitor to benefit his wife, or he could give the wrong information or damage this competitor's companies through incorrect advice or some other malfeasance. So there is a conflict of interest. So the question is basically asking, where there is a conflict of interest, what do you need to do? So the first one is ensure that a tax agent service is provided competently. I mean, that's correct, and it is one of the categories of the fundamental principles, but remember what we're trying to do is find the most correct response, and that doesn't really necessarily fit in with the situation where they're talking about a competitor and a conflict of interest situation. Competency is not really relevant to this particular situation. So B is an agent must comply with taxation laws in the conduct of their personal affairs. And again, I mean, that comes down to, other responsibilities, and yes, that's correct, but is it the most correct, in this particular question? Probably not. Doesn't particularly relate to conflict of interest. Okay, C, an agent must knowingly obstruct the proper administration of the taxation laws. Again, not super relevant, right? So that's more about, other responsibilities and, integrity as well, but it's not clearly related to the situation. And then finally, D, an agent must have in place adequate arrangements for the management of conflicts of interest. So clearly that's going to be the correct answer because that deals with the specifics of this question, which is about conflict of interest. And it also talks about here, which you mentioned, applying safeguards to eliminate threats or reduce them to an acceptable level. So clearly D is the correct answer. And just remember, and this is a great example of that, so even if the other answers are all correct as well, we're trying to find the most correct answer and the most relevant to our particular situation. Okay, next question is, the Tpb Code of Contact contains 14 principles under 5 separate categories. Which of the following principles relates to competence? Okay, so A, you must act lawfully in the best interest of your client. B, you must comply with the taxation laws in the conduct of your personal affairs. C, you must maintain membership of an accredited professional accounting body. D, you must maintain knowledge and skills relevant to the tax agent services you provide. So just to quickly recap, it's talking about these 5 categories of 14 fundamental principles right over here. So honesty, independence, confidentiality, competence, other responsibilities. They want to know within competence which one is the most related. So we didn't really go through this in specific detail. So for this one, we're going to have to use common sense, right? So competency is having the necessary skill set to be able to lodge a tax return, right? And again, consider the context of the question. We're talking about TPB, so we're talking about the Taxation Practitioners Board as opposed to the APES, which is a broader for all types of accountants, auditors, management accountants, and so forth, right? So we want to know something which is specifically related to tax agent services and maintaining the skills and knowledge that they can do their job effectively. So look out for fraud, make sure they understand all the acts so they lodge everything correctly and so forth. So let's go through this. So lawfully, not really competence, it's more about integrity. Comply with taxation laws. Again, that's more about integrity, making sure you're doing the right thing. So that would be, what the laws are, but you're doing the wrong thing. So that's integrity. You must maintain membership of an accredited professional accounting body. So I mean, to an extent, that's correct. And if there was APES, then potentially that would be correct. But as a tax agent, you don't necessarily need to be a member of a professional accounting body, right? As long as you pass the test and you have the necessary qualifications, you don't necessarily need to be a professional body. You can still be a member of the tax TPB. So C is also incorrect, even though it is correct to have maintain membership and relevant skills. That's probably almost correct. So D is you must maintain knowledge and skills relevant to the tax agent services you provide. So this hits the hammer on the head because it's got maintaining but knowledge and skills, and also it's custom to the tax agent service of this particular question is asking. So full marks there. Alright, next question is Jill is registered with a TPB as a BAS agent. Which of the following areas is she not permitted to advise her clients on? A. GST law, B. PAYG withholding, C. luxury card legislation, or D. Tax depreciation schedules. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to bring up our notes and we're just going to go to the section on TPB, in particular what is actually covered under a BAS agent. So GST is fairly straightforward, right? GST is under BAS. So is PAYG withholding, that's clearly there. And then luxury car tax is also included in there. So clearly by deduction, D is the incorrect answer, but let's just think logically and just double check in case D is also wrong, we've missed something. So tax depreciation is not on this list, and also logically we know that tax depreciation comes in as part of income tax. That would be a tax agent, not a BAS agent. Okay, so the answer for this one is D. Okay, next question. So Barry needs a new car and he despises paying tax. His tax agent has advised him that a novated lease will reduce his tax bill. What type of behavior is this an example of? Tax fraud, tax evasion, tax planning, or tax avoidance? So to go through this question, what we're going to do is we're going to pull up each of the different of the scale of ethics and legality. So tax planning, avoidance, and tax fraud. So just do a quick recap of what they mean. So tax planning is legitimate, it's morally acceptable, it's about minimizing your tax payable within the legal framework provided under the Income Tax Act or other relevant acts. Tax avoidance is following the laws, but you're not following it to the spirit of the law. So it's legal but unethical. And then this one is just completely disregarding the law. You're doing fraudulent things, illegal things, and so forth. It's unethical and illegal. So if his tax agent has advised him that a novated lease will reduce his tax bill, a novated lease is perfectly legal, right? It's just like leasing a car instead of buying it, and potentially you get a tax deduction if it's a business item, right? So the question is this, let me translate these answers. Is this illegal and unethical? Is this legal but unethical? Is this legal and ethical? And this is pretty much the same as the first one. So is this this is the, or is this legal but unethical? So the answer is a novated lease is legal and it's also not unethical. So it's perfectly ethical to do that. So the answer is C, tax planning. Fairly straightforward. Okay, next question is Gemma is a tax advisor and her client has lost a case at the AET on a question of law. The client is disappointed and wishes to appeal the decision. Which of the following describes the available options for the client? A. The decision of the AAT is final and conclusive and no appeals are available. B. The client could appeal to the federal court with the case to be heard by a single judge. C. The client could appeal to the full federal court where a majority decision would prevail. D. The client could appeal by special leave to the High Court where a binding decision could be made. Alright, so to do this, let's pull up our notes over here and just go to the framework of the court system. So here we have over here. So if you remember from the core content video, we talked about if there's an appeal from the AAT, it would then go to a federal court, and you'll note over here it tells you how many people there are. So this would be a single judge, this one will be a full court, so multiple benches. So basically if you have a judgment here and you're appealing it, you go to federal court. If there's a judgment here and you're appealing it, you go to full federal court, and so forth, all the way up to the High Court of Australia. So the difference between federal court and full court is this one has a full bench, this one does not, so single judge. So basically if we apply this to the question, so we know that they've lost a case to the AAT, so they're down here currently and they want to appeal it, so they go up to this next level, federal court. The client is disappointed, wishes to appeal the decision, which of the following describes the available options for the client. So the decision of the AAT is final, conclusive, and no appeals are available. So clearly that's incorrect. That's why we have this system, because if there is some sort of bias or breakdown at a certain level, like at the AAT, there are other frameworks where you can fix this. But theoretically, if the AAT did the right thing, then all of these courts would also agree with them, right? And there'll be no issue, and this person would have to pay all the legal costs. So A is incorrect because it's clearly not final and conclusive. B, the client could appeal to the federal court with a case to be heard by a single judge. Well, we can see that the appeal is going to go here, federal court, single judge. So far, that looks like the correct answer. But let's just double check on C and D just in case. So C, the client could appeal to the full federal court where a majority decision would prevail. So clearly you don't skip a step and go straight to there, so that's incorrect. And then D, the client could appeal by special leave to the High Court where a binding decision would be made. Again, that's incorrect. You don't skip all the way to the High Court. In fact, it's very rare for anything to go to the High Court. So clearly the answer is going to be B. Okay, next question. When tax legislation is submitted to Parliament, which of the following statements is correct? Bills are presented to Parliament for review by the Governor-General. B, bills are drafted by the Commissioner of Taxation under instruction from Treasury. C, the Senate can make a binding amendment to the bill only after the second reading. And D, the Senate can suggest amendments to the bill, but does not have the authority to make them. So to answer this question, the thought process is going to be bring up our notes and go to the progress of taxation bills through Parliament. So we can see here, so we can see here that we start off with draft bill, House Reps, Senate, Governor General, and then law. So let's go through it. So bills, let's figure out which one's incorrect. So A, bills are presented to Parliament for review by the Governor General. So that's clearly incorrect because it's only after it's gone through these houses and Senate, then it goes to the Governor General, who puts his assent on it. So A is incorrect. B, bills are drafted by the Commissioner of Taxation under instruction from Treasury. So also that's clearly incorrect as well, because if we refer to the framework, the ATO is represented by the Commissioner of Taxation, right? But we have a separation of powers between the legislature, judiciary, and executive. So the executive is the ATO and the Commissioner of Taxation. The legislature is the Parliament. They're the ones passing the laws. The executive and the ATO and the Commissioner of Taxation only enforce it and implement it. So they don't draft the bills. The Commissioner of Taxation executive doesn't draft the bills. Okay, C, the Senate can make binding amendments to the bill only after the second reading. Okay, so for C, the Senate can make binding amendments to the bill only after the second reading. So if we go back to the original sections that we went through in the core content video, we know that the Senate shall not originate and amend the proposed laws imposing taxation or proposed laws appropriating revenues or monies, blah, blah, blah. They can make amendments in specific cases which is only when the government, as long as it does not increase any proposed charge or burden to the people, and it doesn't relate to ordinary annual services. So basically, in 90% of the cases, the Senate cannot amend the legislation. So C is also incorrect. So logically, D would be the correct answer, but as per usual, we need to just confirm logically that this makes sense and is correct. Otherwise, we've missed something. So the Senate can suggest amendments to the bill, but does not have authority to make them. Okay, well, yeah, we just went through that. That's also correct. We just said that the Senate, however, may suggest to the House to make such amendments that the Senate itself is unable to make. So D is the correct answer. All right, next question is, who is responsible for collecting revenues for the federal government? A, Treasury. B, the Federal Treasurer. C, Commissioner of Taxation. Or D, Australian Taxation Office. So if we go back to our notes, logically, the executive government departments are the ones that implement the laws, so executive authorities like the ATO collect the cash. So logically, D is going to be the correct answer, but if you're not quite sure, in case it's C or D, obviously Treasury is a department within government which spends the money. That's government department down here. That's not necessarily related to collecting the revenue. So this is probably more of a logic question to figure out the answer. So logically, we can tell it's D. The ATO defers semi-judicial powers to the Commissioner of Taxation, but it is the ATO itself, which is the respective body responsible for collecting revenue. Next question is, okay, so just to clarify, D is the correct answer. So next question is, which of the following statements is incorrect? So tax advisors are empowered to legally minimize taxation for their clients. B, deliberate non-compliance within the tax legislation is described as tax fraud or tax evasion and is an offence. C, tax avoidance constitutes behaviour outside the law and advisors and their clients both face prosecution if found guilty. Or D, a strategy that legally minimises tax for a client can still constitute tax avoidance if it's carried out in a way that's artificial or contrived. Okay, so this is probably a little bit confusing because they're all quite similar to each other. So we want to know which one is incorrect. So if it's correct, then we can move on and skip that one, right? So tax advisors are empowered to legally minimize taxation for their clients. So we discussed that earlier about how tax minimization just basically means that you're working within the framework of the law, you're looking at all the options you have, and you choose the option which allows you to minimize your tax. And you might even pursue actively certain strategies within that framework which allows you to minimize your tax. That's perfectly legal, and they're empowered to do so. So A is correct, but we're trying to find the incorrect one. So let's skip A and move on to B. So deliberate non-compliance with tax legislation is described as tax fraud or tax evasion and is an offence. So if we go down here, what word are they using? They're saying tax fraud or tax evasion. Tax fraud, tax evasion, correct. And these are deliberate breaches of the law, where it says a blameworthy act or omission. So this is deliberate non-compliance, so B is also correct, and it's an offence, and we can move on. Now C is tax avoidance constitutes behaviour outside the law, and its advisors and their clients both face prosecution if found guilty. So if we look at the next one, which is tax avoidance, so tax avoidance is technically illegal but unacceptable. So I mean, it's not outside the law, it's actually within the law, but it's also unethical. But both clients face prosecution for it. So it's not necessarily face prosecution because it's difficult to prosecute if you're following the law to the dollar, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to face prosecution. So there's two things wrong with this. One, it's saying it's outside the law, and two, prosecution if found guilty. So in some cases you could be found prosecution if you're deliberately doing it, but it's not penalised as heavily as tax fraud. So C is incorrect, but let's just confirm D, make sure that we haven't missed something. So D is a strategy that legally minimises tax for a client can still constitute tax avoidance if it carried out in a way that is artificial or contrived. So yes, that's correct. So even if you legally minimize it, but you do it and it doesn't exist, like it's contrived, like it's made up, then that will be tax fraud. For example, claiming deductions for expenditure that never incurred. So that would be contrived or artificial. So D is correct. So clearly the answer is C because that's the only incorrect answer. Okay, next question. Which of these does not have the power of judicial review? A, the full court of the federal court. The full court of the federal court. B, the federal court. C, the high court. Or D, the administrative appeals tribunal. So I mean, logic, you can probably figure this out just by the word in the name. So court, court, court. Courts all have the power of the government and therefore have the power of judicial or law, whereas this one has the word tribunal in it, which is not a court, doesn't have the power of the law. A tribunal is a group of people who get together to help arbitrate an outcome. But let's see if we can find the answer in our notes in case you didn't pick up on that. So we would probably want to look for the so the ATT has quasi-judicial powers. So we know that it doesn't have judicial powers. It has quasi, like kind of, but not really. That's the first clue. High Court, let's see if it actually specifically says that they have judicial power. Well, we know the judiciary, the courts have judicial power because it's in the name. So I think that's all we're going to get out of the notes, but I think we've already figured out the answer based on logic alone. So let's just move on to the next question. That is fine. So the answer is D. Okay, so next question is, which of the following is a suitable question to ask when resolving an ethical dilemma being faced in the workplace? A, what is the easiest solution? B, how will I personally benefit from my decision? C, how will this decision reflect my annual bonus? D, have I considered all the consequences of my decision? So all we have to do is pull up our notes and go to the framework that we've got over here, the ethical dilemma checklist. So number 1, is the easiest solution on there? No. B, how will I personally benefit from my decision? No, it's not on there. And also logically, you can figure out that those wouldn't be on there anyway. C, how would this decision reflect on my annual bonus? Clearly not on there. Logically, it also, you'd be able to figure out it's not going to be one of the requirements. And then D, have I considered all the consequences of my decision? Let's have a look in here. So consider possible causes of action and affected parties. So clearly D is the most correct answer out of all of these. Okay, cool. So next question is, which one of the following would constitute a tax financial advice service provided by a financial advisor? A, providing a client with the annual summary of interest paid on their investments. B, providing a personal advice on life insurance that does not apply or interpret any taxation laws. C, advising a client to use a publicly available online calculator to calculate their own taxation. Or D, providing personal advice to a client about investing in property, including how negative gearing will, in their situation, reduce their taxable income. So this one's pretty easy, right? So all you got to look for tax-specific advice. If it's general advice or financial advice or not advice, like telling them to do their own thing, then obviously it's not tax and financial advice. So we need to look out for tax. There's a few components. Number 1 needs to be related to tax. Number 2, it means to provide advice. So let's have a look. Providing a client with an annual summary. That's just providing them a document. There's no advice, right? So, and I also don't see the tax component in here. So A is clearly incorrect. B is providing advice. Okay, so we've got the advice component on life insurance. Okay, but that does not apply or interpret any taxation laws. Okay, so that's advice, but it's not tax advice. So that's also incorrect. Then C is advising a client on how to use a publicly available online calculator to calculate their own taxation. So this is no advice, even though it is related to tax. So clearly C is incorrect. And then logically D would be the correct answer, but we're just going to make sure just in case we've missed something. So D, providing personal advice. Yes, so we've got advice to a client about investing in property, including how negative gearing, okay, that's tax, will in their situation reduce their taxable, that's tax, income. So we've got advice, we've got tax, so clearly D is the correct answer. Okay, next question is, in relation to tax planning, avoidance, and evasion, which one of the following statements is correct? Tax evasion is difficult to identify because it is difficult to determine if the taxpayer is operating outside the requirements of the tax legislation. B, it is at times difficult to determine whether tax planning becomes tax avoidance. C, tax evasion still arises even though the taxpayer is unaware that they have evaded tax. Or D, the definition of tax avoidance is very clear and all taxpayers is very clear, and all taxpayers must be aware of the distinction between tax planning and tax avoidance to avoid penalties. Okay, so the answer to this one I'm just going to tell you is B, and the reason is because this grey area in terms of when it turns from tax minimization to following the law, where is it, to tax avoidance, is a bit of a grey area, right? Because you're still following the law in both cases, but in one instance it's to the spirit of the law, and one of them it isn't to the spirit of the law. So this one's not to the spirit, this one is to the spirit. So because the spirit is such a qualitative concept, it's not not something you can really define or prove. It therefore becomes difficult to prove that it is within the spirit. The other ones are incorrect because tax evasion is difficult to identify, because it's fairly easy to identify if someone hasn't included their tax return or hasn't included their salary on the tax return and so forth, right? They just do data matching, so that's incorrect. Tax evasion can still arise even though the taxpayer is unaware that they have evaded tax. That's incorrect. They must be aware of it. And then D, the definition of tax avoidance is very clear, and all taxpayers must be aware of the distinction between tax planning and tax avoidance to avoid penalties. So the definition isn't clear, and not all taxpayers need to be aware. So the answer is clearly B. Okay, cool. So I think we'll stop it there for the video. I think we've gone through enough questions that we're just starting to repeat ourselves. But if you want to finish off the rest of the questions, there's still a couple more that you can go through in your own time. I think we've given you enough examples and demonstrated the process, the thought process, how to use the notes and so forth to do really well. So I hope you understand how this kind of video series works, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the videos. So thanks for watching.